going to talk about feudalism. So to give you an idea of how the system of feudalism worked, I've got some chess pieces here. I don't know how many of you have ever played much chess, but it is a strategy game that's kind of based on medieval or Middle Ages warfare and the Middle Ages system of government. So in the chess pieces, you have one king, one queen, and that represents the fact that in feudalism was a monarchy. There was one ruler, usually the king, sometimes a queen, and sometimes the king would be married to a lady who would be the queen, but she didn't really have the power. The power was in one person, the king. And the king had various people that were working with him. For instance, he had some knights. The chess set, the knights are represented by a horse because knights usually were mounted fighters, mounted soldiers, so they had horses and they rode horses in battle. So a king might have several of those. There might, depending on how big his kingdom was, he might have a whole bunch of knights. And there was also a little bit of a class in between here called the nobility, which had various titles, but like count or duke or baron. These were all like little. So feudalism is like a leveled system. At the very top is the king or queen, sometimes, usually king, and then the nobility, barons, counts, dukes, knights, and below them were the common people, which is represented by all these pawns. And this is probably not even a good scale because of all the people in the Middle Ages, most people were peasants or pawns, foot soldiers. They did all the work. They grew the food, they harvested the food, they built things, they did most of the work. The other class you have to take in consideration is these are bishops, which are the church people, the clergymen, the ministers, the preachers. They have their own ranking system from the Pope to cardinals to bishops and all the way down the line to your priests and monks and nuns. But in the chess game, this piece represents the bishops, which is kind of the church. So we're going to go into more detail about that. But notice, talk to your people, your neighbors, about how this system was set up with one person at the very top and then kind of worked its way down levels. So feudalism was a monarchy, which means they only had one ruler, who is the king, sometimes the queen, but usually just the king was the ruler. In the next layer in feudalism would be the nobility, which would be the lords, ladies, the dukes, the barons, the counts. And these were people that were born into certain families. It was a class system. The monarch would also, the king would also be part of the nobility, and the knights would also be part of the nobility. But they were born into this, and the king would hand out land to certain people in return for loyalty. Okay, so the next layer in the chain of command were the knights. The knights were mounted soldiers that served the nobles, protected the nobles and the king. They were loyal to the nobles, and the nobles were loyal to the king. The knights also, sometimes, if the noble had a big area of land, he might divide his land up into smaller pieces and give the knight his own area to work. Sometimes they lived in the castle with the noble, but remember it was a chain. So there was knights were loyal to the nobles, nobles were loyal to the king, the monarch. So talk a minute about what you think about this system, and if it reminds you of anything that you've seen in your life or in other areas. Okay, in the bottom of this system were the peasants. And they're the workers. They're the ones that did all the work. They did all the farming. They probably made all the food. They made the clothes. They worked in the castle. They did all the things that needed to be done that were manual labor. They built buildings. They And they would also fight in the wars. They would be what would be called the foot soldiers if they were able to do that. But most people in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were in this group. If it was a classroom of, say, 25 students, 24 of those students would probably be peasants, and everybody in other classes would make up one person. So there's one other group that I haven't talked about yet, but think about the workers. What would they be like to live in the Middle Ages? Because remember, probably, most likely, 95, 99% probability that if you lived in the Middle Ages, you would be a peasant, you would be a worker. Okay, the other kind of interesting thing about the Middle Ages is how the church was also involved in a lot of things. They kind of have their own system of feudalism. So at the top, kind of where the king is in the other system, they had the Pope, and then beneath the Pope were cardinals, bishops, priests, and then down to the monks and nuns were kind of the common people. And then, of course, the peasants are still down here under this. So one thing that's interesting about the church during the Middle Ages is, like we said before, the common people, for the most part, did not know how to read and write. So they had to rely on the religious leaders to tell them what the Bible said. And one of the things that was a belief in the Middle Ages is called the right of kings. In other words, it was the idea from the church telling the common people that kings are ordained by God. They have the authority of God to govern and rule over everything. And so if people started to get a little bit upset with the system, how it was going, they didn't like their lives, they were complaining, a lot of times the church was telling them, oh no, this is God's plan, the king is put in place by God, you must obey the king. So think about that for a minute and think about how you might feel about that if you were a peasant, or if you were a king, or a noble, or a church person. Okay, to kind of wrap up today, we're talking about feudalism, which was the system of government and also somewhat the system of religion that they had in the Middle Ages in Europe. So I've got a couple questions. First of all, what needs do people have that they would need the government to help them with, or even the church to help them with? And how did feudalism supply those needs? So think about the fall of the Roman Empire. Things are kind of in chaos. There's some anarchy going on. There's lots of wars and fighting and stealing and robbing going on. So how did feudalism help everybody, the common people, the leaders, and so forth? How did feudalism as a system help people meet their needs? And next time we'll go into a little bit more information about the church. So see you next time.